short inquiry into coronavirus in Scotland, the follow-up, and we're delighted to be joined by the Minister, Lord Offord, who I will now allow to introduce himself and anything by way of a short introductory statement. Minister.
Thank you, Chairman. Good afternoon to you and to members of the committee. So I'm pleased to be appearing before you in my role as Parliamentary Under Secretary for Scotland to share the successes of the UK Government support in aiding economic recovery from the COVID pandemic. As we know, the economic shocks of the global COVID-19 pandemic had an unprecedented impact across the world economy. And it's essential to recognise that aside from the pandemic, there have been additional international events that have disrupted the recovery of both economies, including obviously Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the weaponisation of the energy markets. So I'd like to begin by highlighting some of the work this government has and continues to undertake to mitigate against the worst of the economic damage caused by COVID and to reduce inflation. This government reacted to the pandemic using the fiscal levers at its disposal and undertook high levels of public spending. The National Audit Office, who acts as the UK's independent spending watchdog, estimate the cost of measures announced in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic to be £376 billion, which breaks into roughly three buckets: 147 spent supporting business support, 164 billion which was health, social care, including the vaccine, and also public services and emergency responses, and 65 billion supporting individuals and some other operational expenditure. As part of this, including over the 2 years, the Scottish Government received 14.6, call it 15 billion in Barnett consequentials. That's really important because that money was sent early and immediately to the devolved administration in Edinburgh, and received that with its own discretion as how to spend that 15 billion. But obviously, in addition, had access to the UK-wide spending on the overall support schemes. Throughout, the success of these schemes is notable. The furlough and self-employment income support scheme protected jobs and provided support to businesses, protecting 14.6 million individuals across the UK. And it cannot be underestimated that as a result of this government's spending and investment, that the UK became a world leader in securing millions of doses of the most promising vaccines for all parts of the UK, which was paramount in the early reopening of our economy, crucially reigniting the levels of economic activity to save businesses across the UK. So just including, the Scotland Office is also providing evidence to other COVID inquiries, in addition to this one, including the independent UK COVID-19 inquiry led by Baroness Hallett, and we await the outcome of this alongside this committee's report. So I'm happy to take any questions this afternoon. Chair.
We're grateful. Thank you ever so much for a very concise opening statement. And you're absolutely right, there seems to have been a number of issues which have compounded post-COVID recovery, and I think you're right to mention the war in Ukraine and obviously the issues around the energy prices and cost of living. What is the UK government doing to make sure that we counter the worst impacts and effects of the cost of living crisis that all our constituents are currently confronting?
So it's like we've had a bit of a perfect storm, because the COVID pandemic, what it really did for the business world, and that came down to the consumer world, was really bring into focus the supply chain of what we have, the globalisation, 15 years of globalisation, and how the supply chains got disrupted. So that was a major disruption to the world economy. Of course, obviously, then the world economy shut down. Followed then, hard on the heels by that, we then have the Ukraine situation, which has completely disrupted our world supplies of hydrocarbon and also lots of agricultural materials. So those coming together have been a massive disruption. Now, actually, if you look at the UK government's response to both of those, we've mentioned 376 billion for COVID, but we should also highlight 94 billion for the overall cost of living and energy crisis. These are record sums of money. Pre-COVID, the UK government was borrowing 50 billion a year, just to put that in context. So if you take 400, thick end of 400 for COVID and 100 for cost of living, in the last 3-4 years, the UK government spent 500 billion, whereas ordinarily it'd be 50 over 2 years, it'd be 100 billion. So it's been big numbers. If you look at what that's actually meant for the population. Obviously, the main thing has been with helping with bills, with the energy bills. The UK government's effectively paid half of domestic energy bills through this period. And then it's put some very targeted action. Cost of living payments to hundreds of thousands, certainly in Scotland, Scottish households, we've got 639,000 disability payments being made. The actual energy support in Scotland was 7 billion. So to put that in context, the Scottish NHS budget is 17 billion, education is 8.5 billion, 7 billion spent by the UK government on Scottish energy support bills. Big numbers. And then you can add in all the fact that the poorest households in Scotland received effectively 2 months net pay. They received effectively 22% of average household income in that. So trying to be targeted, then the support to 1 million pensioners, helping them heat their homes. So trying to be targeted, in addition to the broader things, obviously the state pension was increased in line with inflation, the uprating of benefits in line with inflation, the national living wage gone up by a record amount. So there's been a package of measures, as I say, coming to 94 billion spread across the UK, of which Scotland's very much had her fair share.
Grateful for that. And at the same time, we're still finding it, 53% are finding it harder to keep their home warm, 46% are eating lower quality food, 40% feel they're less prepared to participate in hobbies or pastimes, 24% have cut back the number of meals eaten. This is a really dreadful situation for our constituents. And the one word we've not heard in the 7 minutes since this session has started is Brexit. And I think you'll know the figures that LSE have come up with recently, which said that the cost of Brexit has cost something like £7 billion to be added to UK food bills, an average of £250 per household. Surely Brexit has got something to do with the difficulties that the UK finds itself in and why we drag behind international competitors when it comes to this recovery.
There's no evidence of this at all. These are selective numbers. If you look at what's happening in Europe, food inflation is running at the same level as in the UK. Energy prices are at the same level in Germany, France as they are in the UK. They didn't have a Brexit, so I don't see that there's any correlation at all with Brexit. These are world events. These are massive world disruptions that no one could have foreseen. Once in a generation, you might even say for the biggest disruption to our economy since the Second World War in 70 years. And there's it doesn't respect borders. These wars and these pandemics don't respect borders, and there are the same issues on cost of living in Europe as there is in the UK, so I don't accept the Brexit.
Why does the UK lag behind the rest of our European partners when it comes to these issues? And why have we got about the lowest GDP growth in the whole of Europe? Why is there a specific difficulty in Europe? And this idea that
we don't, because since 2016, since we had that vote, our economy's grown at 7%, Germany's grown at 6%, so I don't recognise that. And if you look at what we spent in the pandemic, we spent 19% of our GDP on protecting the UK. The only country with the highest spend is the US, 25%. We equal New Zealand at 19%. So you cannot say in any way, and using any objective information and data, that the UK did anything other than throw the full resources, the full weight of the UK Treasury at this issue, and to the benefit of all of us.
I suppose today's figures and mortgage costs will have absolutely nothing to do with Brexit again too.
Mortgage costs are the same in the US.
You find them, the average rate in a deal now is 6.66%, which actually surpasses the situations it was in
mortgage costs are the same in the US.
Mini budget just a year ago. The latest figure for inflation is 7.9% in the year to May. But again, this will have nothing to do with Brexit. Brexit's got nothing to do with any of these figures.
No, because
this is a view of the UK government.
Because mortgage costs are a factor of world. These are international markets. You don't have differentials between UK, Europe, and US. These are basically international markets which trade with each other. The cost of US mortgages are the same. It's tracked exactly the same as the UK.
So like the UK is keeping up to pace with the rest of the major economies in the world. Is that what you're saying to us today?
Well, our trade has bounced back very strongly. A record trade performance last year. We had trade with the EU went up 24% last year. So we've got big trade bounce back going on in the UK. There is no question that interest rates going up is a problem for all the major economies. All the G7 economies got the same issue.
No problem here, then, is basically what you're saying to this.
I'm not saying there's no problem. I'm not saying there's no problem. You don't conflate what I'm saying. these are difficult issues for everyone to deal with. These impact on everyone's livelihoods, households. UK government is trying to mitigate that through specific targeted cost of living measures. The Bank of England is charged with getting inflation down. And so there's mitigation taking place. I'm not belittling in any way the day-to-day impact of that. But the point you're trying to make is that we're a lot worse off than everyone else. And we're not.
Well, we'll let everybody have a look at the figures to see what they think of that. We'll have to move on. Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Minister. Apologies, first of all. I will have to leave probably before the end, but I will try to come back. You've mentioned the amount of money that was spent during the pandemic. A decade's worth of spending, really, in the space of those 2 years. And it was spent for businesses in Scotland, and it was described by a lot of people as speedy. Although I have to say that wasn't always reflected in the comments I got from businesses in my constituency in Edinburgh West. Many got the support, but sometimes it took time to come through. So what would you say were the lessons that the UK government has learned and the things that it wouldn't repeat if there was another pandemic?
Well, I mean, obviously this was being done in real time. I mean, the fact you use speedy is actually really interesting, because that was, in a way, the most important thing, was to get this out fast. And certainly in terms of how the UK government dealt with devolved administrations, was an immediate, the Barnett consequences were immediately sent up with a guarantee. So immediately devolved administrations had complete control of effectively half the budget for coronavirus. And there might be one or two differences between Scotland and England, but you'd have to examine that from a Scottish government point of view. As far as the UK government is concerned, the money was sent in short order. You know, when all these public inquiries will go on, there will be lessons that will have to be learned in that, because within some of that speedy response to get the need, to try and assuage the need immediately, there was obviously some fraud, for example, in some of the business support schemes. We know that perhaps some of the equipment procurement, could have been improvements in procurement. My feeling is that these will be dealt with quite specifically by the COVID inquiries. And I'm not really here to sort of prejudge what my opinion of those are. I think they will be considered, and as a nation, as a community, we will then say to ourselves, how do we get ourselves better prepared for the next time? But I think I would say that there has to be some consideration and credit given to the Treasury. They're not usually the easiest people to get money out of, and they sent it fast. And they sent it fast to the benefit of all our communities. So I think overall that the speedy is, in this context, is a good word, even if it resulted in perhaps some profligate spending in places, or even some fraudulent spending. But the emphasis was get this money fast to people who need it the most.
You mentioned the fraud or the fraudulent activity. Do you think there's some resentment now, or have you noticed any resentment amongst the public, particularly in Scotland, that nothing appears to have been done to rectify that fraudulent activity?
I haven't picked that up as being any particular different in Scotland versus England. I mean, what's interesting to me is, 80-20 rule norm is quite a good rule in life. And I was speaking to the British Business Bank about this, and it does work out early numbers about 80-20. So 80% good loans, which tells you that the population of the UK is actually fundamentally a trustworthy population. And they repay their loans, and that, I think, is a massive tick in the box for us, for all of us as a community. Yes, there's fraud, and what's happened there is that some people who set out to defraud, it's very difficult to stop them, especially when it's done fast. But it's our job now, isn't it, to come back and uncover that and punish that. But not, if you're saying, should we have done it slower?
No. To
stop the fraud? My view is 80% good. 80% of people are good people, need the immediate support. We're right to do that, and then we can deal with the 20%. Okay.
Was there anything else that the UK government would perhaps change when it comes to supporting businesses? And I'm thinking specifically about the excluded, the number of individual businesses, sole traders, etc., who found themselves unable to access the scheme. Is there anything you would change about that?
Yes. I mean, that's where I would say, again, not a differential anyway between England and Scotland, but if there was some grumbling, it was from the sole traders. They had to prove X number of years, average earnings, etc. not everyone had the books in the right shape to do that. That's probably the most difficult group to lend to, perhaps, because they are sole traders, as it were. That I think we could improve.
Would it be fair to characterise what you're saying as there may have been mistakes, but the important thing was to get the money out quickly?
Yes, and to meet the immediate need and keep 15 million jobs alive, keep businesses alive that otherwise would have gone under.
4 minutes.
I would say.
Yeah. Mark Mingus.
I had 4 minutes. She only had 4 minutes.
You finished?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, Minister, furlough scheme, I think, has been recognised by many as being critical in keeping the jobs of ordinary people going at a critical time. And many businesses in Scotland certainly used it during the pandemic. What assessments have you made of the furlough scheme in Scotland, and what do you think the best policy response was for Scotland during the pandemic? Do you think it was a furlough scheme, or with hindsight, is there anything else that could have sprung to mind?
No, I think the furlough scheme was the immediate, impactful measure. I mean, and it came fast, so it reassured people immediately that their livelihoods would be protected. And it was uniform across the United Kingdom. I think that was really important. There was no concept that one area got special treatment versus another area. You might say that would be the strength of a unitary response from the Treasury. Yes, it respected the devolution settlement, and yes, through the Barnett consequentials, devolved administrations were able to then get their share and do their particular finessing on it. But the overall concept was a unitary concept, just like the vaccine was a unitary concept. So I'd say the two most important things were the furlough scheme and the vaccine.
And is there anything, I mean, looking back on it, if the scheme was run again, are there any changes that you would advocate on behalf of Scotland? Any sort of tweaks or amendments? Or
I think, again, I would say that this is exactly the line of inquiry that these COVID inquiries have to go down, and they will do. They have to go, I think, there'll be some regional examination, presumably with England as well. I think the Scottish inquiry will look at exactly that. There wasn't intended to be any differentiation. This is the whole point. The point was meant to be a UK-wide response. But if, in fact, there has been demonstrated some differences, we'll need to look at those. But no, as far as the Scotland Office is concerned, we feel that it was our job in the Scotland Office to make sure that if there are particular Scottish characteristics, they were represented, which we did do. We sat in all the meetings with the Treasury in putting this together. We were sat in the intergovernmental meetings to make sure everyone was represented. And our view of it would be that it was done fairly and equally across the whole UK.
you work very, very closely with Scottish businesses, and part of your role is to act as that champion and voice for Scottish businesses, sort of within the United Kingdom. Is there anything that stands out? Is there anything that they've raised with you to say, look, all of this went well, thanks very much, but would have liked to have seen some changes? So from the business community, is there anything at this stage that springs out at you as things that they would like to have seen?
I mean, there were little differences. There were some differences put in place between some of the Scottish schemes and the English schemes, but that was because the Scottish Government decided they wanted to do things slightly differently. And you must take that up with them. For example, some of the business grants that were dependent on number of premises. It was different in England, for example, versus different in Scotland. And, we had complaints and grumbles about that, but that's part of the devolution settlement, which the Scottish Government have got the leeway to decide what's best for Scotland in that scenario. So again, I would say that should be, that needs to be looked at through the individual COVID inquiries.
And just a final question on this, Chair. What sort of rough number do you have, if any, of the number of jobs in Scotland that were secured or protected as a result of the furlough scheme?
I can give you the exact number, which is right here. So the furloughed jobs in Scotland, 911,900 against 11.7 million across the UK. And in terms of the self-employed scheme, there was 1.7 billion spent in the self-employed scheme. There was 4 billion spent in Scotland on the bounce back loans and coronavirus CBILS loans. There was 8.3 billion on the future fund. The business community in Scotland ended up with 6% of business support, because that represents exactly a proportionate share of our business. So it was done very much on population and proportionate and therefore Scotland got absolutely equal share with.
Oh, huge numbers by anyone's measure.
Huge numbers. I mean, the 15 billion. If Scotland takes its support of the 376 being 30 billion or so, I mean, it costs 90. The cost of running Scotland is 90 billion a year. Okay, so it's a third of that in 1 year.
Right. Thanks, Chair. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Chair and Lord Offord. Good to see you. I just want to pick up on a question there in relation to the furlough data you just provided. Given that I want to look a little bit at the economically inactive, do you have any data on those who were on furlough but did not stay in work or return to work?
Yes, I do. If I can just find that. The economically inactive number is a number that I'm really interested in. In my new job as Minister for Exports, I come back. I said, anyway, ignore that. The economic activity in Scotland is at 22.3%, slightly above the UK average at 20.8%, but it's roughly 1 in 5. Work.
And in some areas it can be much worse than that.
Yes.
But I just wondered, my specific question was
pre-pandemic,
in terms of the furlough support.
Pre-pandemic's the same.
Okay.
Which I was surprised to find that number. It was the same before. Quarter 4 29, 22.2%. Quarter 1 2023, 22.2%. So it would appear that those that were classified as economically inactive beforehand have remained stubbornly the case. What has happened is that a number of people have come out of the workforce who are not classified as economically inactive because they might have taken early retirement or etc. They're doing other things. But in terms of that specific cohort, it's remained stubbornly high at 1 in 5.
Okay, so I suppose my question was do you feel that furlough did keep people in work that could have stayed in work? Because I suppose my question is are we seeing that there were people that were furloughed who are now not in work, and so therefore the scheme wasn't successful in that regard?
On the face of the numbers, it looks as if the scheme has done what it was meant to do. On the face of the numbers, we've got record unemployment. We've got record low unemployment, around 4% of those who are registered to be looking for work. We have then a similar number of economically impact before and after, inactive before and after. So therefore, on the face of the numbers, the workforce that was in place before COVID is back in the workplace.
So on this economically inactive piece, I know there's been lots of talk about golf courses, and I've got lots of golf courses in my constituency, but that's certainly not where economically inactive people tend to be. And certainly in certain parts of Scotland, there's a rate as almost as high as 50% of people are inactive due to ill health or disability. What conversations are you having with your DWP colleagues in terms of the levers that they can be utilising in Scotland to bring that number down?
So this is a very big conversation, and it's UK-wide, because the number is roughly the same, 20.8 versus 22.3, call it 1 in 5. So again, this doesn't respect borders, it's not nationalities. We've got a situation where we have 20% of our workforce not working and not required to seek employment, and we know that 1/3 of them are on long-term sickness benefit. We also know when we interview them that certainly 1/3 of them say they want to work. So they want to work, but they've lost a pathway to work, to get back to work. Add to that, we've got record labour shortages in our businesses. What's the number one thing you and I ask when we go and see businesses is labour shortages, right? So the big opportunity here, and this actually is potentially a benefit of Brexit, now that we control our own immigration policy, rather than bringing in Romanian graduates to do manual labour, which is bad for Romania. And you know, we have got an opportunity now, haven't we, to redesign how we look after our whole community and help people back to work, because it's a great resource. They're a great resource, and the most resilient people we have in our community who are wanting to work, not able to work. So there is now a lot of work going on within DWP around this big question: is how do we help those people in our society back into jobs when there are jobs available? And if we look at the modern economy, and you look at what the Chancellor's saying about his five modern, the growth industries, whether you take digital, the whole digital thing, whether you take green energy, whether you take life sciences, whether you take advanced manufacturing or creative industries, what's interesting is that within each of those pyramids, there are different levels jobs for each individual. And there are terrific foundation level jobs as well as high-end jobs, And if we're going to redesign our economy around these new pyramids and new growth industries, isn't this a great opportunity now for us to accommodate those who are not working to bring them into work?
So I share your views on employment of the future, but did you share my frustration that we didn't see an employment bill come forward from the government that might have actually taken those jobs of the future and lined it up with the most effective employment practices? Because obviously the flexible working bill has come forward as a PMB, my own Carers Leave Act, because so many unpaid carers can't stay in work because of their caring responsibilities. You share my frustration that we've not actually done that in quite a much more planned and pragmatic way.
Well, I think like all these things, there are different stages on this journey, and the journey, that the first stage of it has been very much around the whole childcare parent conundrum. The announcement in the last budget was very much based on allowing people the flexibility to get back into the workplace, and that's a major initiative around this whole thing.
Well, the childcare policy in Scotland has devolved.
Well, that's right, but if you look at the Barnett consequentials, it's like something 300 million or so sent up to Scotland, which is not bifurcated to Scotland. The Scottish government do what they want with it, but if they took the equivalent number, they could run a similar scheme. So that's up to the Scottish government to decide what to do. But there is a lot of effort going into one part of the labour force, particularly mothers, to help them back into the workplace. The next piece of this needs to now be about how we get our economically inactive back to work.
So my final question on that, and as you rightly say, over to the Scottish Government in terms of what they do, but there will be people in the economically inactive category who are suffering from long COVID. Do you share my concern about the really small amount of money in the big round that the Scottish Government is putting into long COVID, which averages out about £17 per head as opposed to £58 per head in England and £88 in Wales?
Yes, but that's... At the end of the day, under the devolution settlement, which is the most generous settlement of devolution of its kind in the world, it is down to the Scottish Government to decide what their priorities are. It's not for us to dictate to them how they do that, and it's up to the people of Scotland to decide whether they like them or not.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
David Duckett.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Minister, for coming along today. Please pass on my regards to Chris in his absence. A lot of what you're talking about actually brings back memories to me, because obviously I was a minister in the Scotland office during the whole period of, for the first year of it certainly, of COVID. But in terms of recovery, and following on from Wendy Chamberlain's questioning on the economically inactive, I was just wondering, obviously I'm very mindful of my own constituency being in the north east of Scotland. You've been there. We've had this conversation about the very, very low unemployment we have, and there are people, as you've described, looking for work, want to work. From a Scotland Office point of view, what's being done, working with other government departments, to try and encourage people to move or get to where the work actually is, where the jobs are?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the frustrations, isn't it? That how do you match the available labour to the actual where the jobs actually exist? I mean, Aberdeenshire, Banff and Buchan, Moray are some of the most beautiful places to live in Scotland, and there's jobs available, and there's good, well-paid jobs available. So the frustration is, how can we not persuade some people to come from the Central Belt who are not working to go there? One of the major barriers is obviously housing. And then we get into the whole issue of what's devolved, what's reserved, and how do you actually move the needle on this? At the end of the day, my view on this is that Scotland, with a population of 5.5 million, is the best placed part of the United Kingdom to affect radical change. And these are problems that exist in the whole United Kingdom, and we should be doing what we always do, is lead the charge on this and reinvent this in Scotland as a definable entity in the UK, with all the benefit of UK financing. If we could work, I think that's the challenge for these two governments to work together, devolved and reserved. Say, how does Scotland become an exemplar in exactly this area? I mean, because with these you talk about these 5 new growth industries. This is happening in Orkney, it's happening in Shetland, it's happening in the Western Islands, it's happening up in what we used to patronisingly call remote areas. Well, they're not remote, they're actually central. I mean, what's happening around in terms of energy around Orkney and Shetland is central to energy, isn't it? So I think we have a great opportunity in Scotland to redesign how we do things, and that will be about how do we persuade some of our population to move to where the jobs are.
I couldn't agree more with your point about how, say that whether it's the North East for being an energy centre, well, actually Orkney and Shetland have been long oil and gas centres of excellence, but they're rapidly becoming more and more centres of excellence in the renewable sector as well. Loads of exciting opportunities, and I must thank you as well for emphasising the beauty of the locations and why would people not want to live where I come from. I'm sure Douglas Ross would agree. But going back to what Christine Jarding was asking about the actual steps taken during COVID, and there was lots of, you said a lot about what financial support was made. In terms of so there was different, between Scotland and the rest of the UK, there was different levels of lockdown and different timings of lockdowns.
Yes.
And different levels of health protection. What assessment, if any, has been done by the Scotland Office on what impact that has had, if any?
Well, exactly, in making that inquiry and going through the statistics are actually quite interesting on this. If you look at coronavirus deaths, Scotland versus the United Kingdom, in terms of how they're recorded in the records, they're identical between Scotland and the UK. It's a third of 1% of the population in both the UK and Scotland. So therefore, what that says to me is that we had a uniform result, because in the main we had a unitary policy response. We gave a fair and unitary response in terms of funding, in terms of vaccines, in terms of messaging. There were some points of difference. And maybe that was more cultural than anything, but when you actually look at the numbers, it turns out that the outcomes were identical.
So the health outcomes?
The health outcomes.
But what about economic
identical.
outcomes? Was there any effect on the differences in how much the different areas were locked down?
Again, we look at the economic data between the UK and Scotland, and we find it's pretty much identical. If anything, Scotland's tiny little bit ahead in terms of GDP recovery.
Okay.
So, it is quite interesting that, we had different messaging. We had, for example, the UK was hands, face, space, and Scotland had facts. Do you remember what they were?
What facts?
Yeah.
Face. Where. I just used hands, face, space, quite frankly. Did the same job.
The facts. Maybe the chair can remember.
Facts was harder to remember.
What was facts? What was facts in
We'll just
Scotland?
get on with asking questions of you, Minister.
Well, this is
It was a good
part of the
attempt.
minister's
anyway.
answer.
You finished, David?
That's the end of my questions.
Okay,
Since I
thank you.
couldn't answer the minister's question.
Douglas Ross.
Thank you, Chair. Can I start by correcting the Chair? The Chair said this was our final evidence session in this inquiry, but of course we hope it's not, because we've now had 3 refusals from the Deputy First Minister of Scotland, Shona Robeson, to appear before this inquiry. And I'm very grateful that we have a UK Government Minister here. We all as a committee, and indeed the Chair as an SNP member, has told us that he's tried personally to get a member of the Scottish Government in front of us. And I think it's going to be very difficult for us to do a report on this issue if we only hear from one side. So hopefully your presence here today, Minister, will finally encourage a Scottish Government representative to attend. And that's really where I want to start, perhaps following on from David Ducatt's points. There was undoubtedly differences in terms of the way the funding was spent, and you've made it very clear that funding was given by the UK Government to the Scottish Government and they could take their own decisions. You've also done an awful lot of outreach in Scotland in your ministerial roles. Did you pick up any concerns from businesses about that differentiation? Because certainly what we heard last week from the Federation of Small Business was that in many cases they would have liked a UK-wide approach. So businesses in England would have received the same support as businesses in Scotland. Is that something you've picked up?
Yes, there were grumbles. That's the issue, is it? When you have slightly different differences between regions, some are better than worse. I personally would have favoured a completely uniform approach. In the main, it was mostly uniform, but yes, there were grumbles from the small business community, from the self-employed, and from the farming community had grumbles as well. And That again, I think is a very valid level of inquiry for the Scottish COVID inquiry, because I think that's really where the Scottish COVID inquiry needs to really drill in to see where Scotland did diverge from the UK. Was it better or worse?
Are you aware of any reasons why the Scottish Government diverged from the UK Government's decisions other than to be slightly different? Were the Scotland office informed of legitimate and good reasons to take a different path, or were you just aware when everyone else was that certain businesses wouldn't be covered by something that was covered elsewhere in the UK?
We didn't come across any particular reason. Our emphasis at Scotland office was to make sure, just Scotland being Scotland with 8% of the population, 33% of the geography, has got a more remote, a great number of remote communities, and we were just absolutely very focused on making sure that we had uniform treatment wherever you lived in Scotland. We were really focused on that. We didn't see any particular evidence as to why a small business in Motherwell was different from a small business in Warrington. We didn't really see any circumstantial evidence of that.
Yeah. Another thing that we're looking at, and the Auditor General in Scotland has also looked at, is the full amount of COVID support passed from the UK Government to the Scottish Government being spent for COVID support in Scotland. Are you concerned that the Auditor General in Scotland has been unable to qualify the entire amount of money that's gone from the UK Government to the Scottish Government and to see if it was fully spent on COVID-related issues? I think the figure is £1.6 billion.
Yes.
He's been unable attribute to that.
So, yes, of course. I mean, that's why I say it's the most extraordinary concept of devolution that you wouldn't get in the general German federal system or the US federal system. When Washington sends money to individual states, they want an audit of it. They want to know where it was spent. Actually, it's extraordinary in the UK that it's a completely devolved scenario. Money under the Barnett consequentials and the block grant goes from London to Edinburgh with no strings attached.
And I mean, what is the UK Government's response to that Auditor General report? I mean, do you then follow that up? Do you look at this further? Now, I understand decisions had to be taken very quickly, and you're right to get money out to support as many people as possible. It was the right approach for the UK Government to take. But there are businesses and individuals in Scotland who still feel they should have received some of that funding and are very upset to find that the Scottish Auditor General is unable to account for all that money.
Yes. And this is a question which is now being asked repeatedly in the chamber in which I reside.
I think it's slightly different. I don't want to go there because I think that's more generally on spending. But particularly for COVID spending, if I could maybe ask for an example, I think we've both met Scotland Learning Partnership.
Yes.
They have raised serious concerns that they were promised by John Swinney, by Richard Lockhead, by other ministers, that they were going to get money that had been given by the UK Government to the Scottish Government, and they did not and still have not received that funding. Yes. Is that your recollection of your meetings?
Absolutely. I met them. And in fact, nicely, coming to Wendy Chamberlain's question about economically inactive, I mean, they are front and centre in this battle to help our most vulnerable back into work, who want to work. Yeah, and it's all to do with adult learning. It's all to do with retraining, and that's where we need to put a lot of focus. And we both agree that the best form of welfare one can ever have is a good job. And there's people in that adult community who want to get a good job and need help to get there. And that particular community, that particular group, I was so impressed when I met them that that's what their life's work is, and yet they're starved of funding.
Mm-hmm. But funding that they believe
were promised.
And indeed, I think they've shown us correspondence, or certainly me correspondence, which I'm quite happy to share with the committee, that they had been given assurances from several Scottish Government ministers they would receive that COVID funding, and they still haven't. And then that does beg the question, well, is that part of the £1.6 billion that the Auditor General cannot account for?
And this is where I would expect the Scotland COVID inquiry to make full inquiry.
It would also be an opportunity for the Deputy First Minister of Scotland to answer these questions if she attended this committee.
I will recommend this committee to her.
Well, hopefully that will work where other efforts have not. The Chair also mentioned Brexit, and he was surprised it hadn't been raised in the opening 7 minutes of this inquiry session. Maybe that's because this inquiry is not about Brexit, it's about coronavirus. So if I could look at coronavirus, but looking at Europe, you mentioned the vaccine rollout. Is your view, the UK Government's view, that we would have had as fast, as successful a vaccine rollout in Scotland and across the UK if we were still part of the EU?
Well, that's not a matter of opinion. That is, it's self-evident that because we'd come out of the EU, we were able to then plot our own response, and which we would have not been able to do. We'd have had to go on with the EU-wide scheme. And if you remember, at one point the French and the Germans were very annoyed with the UK because we had stolen a march on them, because we actually put our money down and signed contracts and got ourselves early supplies of the vaccines, which we would not have been able to have done if we'd been part of the EU. So it's not a matter of opinion, it's just a matter of fact that we were able to proceed faster.
And that then also allowed us to lift the restrictions across the UK and slightly later in Scotland, because more people were protected quicker than other parts of the EU and across the world.
Right.
Which therefore allowed our economy to hopefully get in a better position at an earlier stage, because people were getting out and about more, being able to spend money and get back to work.
Yes, but if you take the fact that the three high spending economies were the US, UK and New Zealand, by definition those three are, well, they're independent countries, and so actually they were perhaps able to, they all took their individual responses but act fast, spent the most amount of money and came out perhaps the quickest.
And finally, can I ask, how do you view the relations between the Scottish and the UK government during the pandemic? There was a time, I think, as you said, early on in the pandemic where they worked very closely. It then started to diverge a bit more as the pandemic continued. Were there opportunities that were missed for better collaboration between the two governments? And is that a lesson that this committee can look at in our inquiry report? Could there have been better working relations between the two governments to provide a more unified response to this pandemic?
Well, as I said, the response financially and from a health point of view was UK-wide, even to the point of the UK armed services being deployed in Scotland as much as, if not more so actually, in England to deploy it. So, and there were intergovernmental meetings going on, and former Minister David Duckett would have been involved in that. I personally wasn't involved at that moment, but the record shows there was a lot of intergovernmental interaction on these decisions. Ultimately, again, through the devolution settlement, the Scottish Government wanted to set its own tone, set its own messaging, back to facts, and wanted to finesse its own schemes. And all I'm observing is at the end of it, they were perhaps on the margin. The overall response was uniform, and the outcome was actually uniform. Scotland's outcomes ended up being the same as the UK.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, Lord Offord. It's interesting to hear Mr Ross raise the issue of COVID, because I noted in the first evidence session recently of the UK COVID inquiry, they were told that planning for a no-deal Brexit crowded out efforts of the UK government to prepare for a pandemic, which was something. Actually, I don't know why I'm being interrupted. I said quiet.
I was on. Sorry, I didn't. Can you repeat that?
Sure.
Let's ask questions.
Can we start the clock again, perhaps, Mr Wishart? Thank you. The recent first evidence session of the UK COVID inquiry heard that planning for a no-deal Brexit crowded out efforts that the UK government were making to prepare for a pandemic. Preparations for Operation Yellowhammer, I think, were specifically referenced. And that was a point that was echoed by the former First Minister of Scotland when she gave evidence at the same inquiry. As a passionate Brexiter yourself, did you have regrets? Did you reflect upon that information and then have regrets about how this was handled? Were there ways that the UK government could have handled this rather more competently?
Yeah, I don't recognise the premise here. The evidence doesn't back this up, I'm afraid. Okay. The evidence is that we had a faster rollout and we came out of lockdown faster, and the economy hasn't been damaged any worse than the European economy. So I don't understand the premise of the question. If I remind you how angry the French and the Germans were that we had the vaccine deal sewed up months before they did.
Okay, but I think what the inquiry was hearing was that work that could have been devoted to planning for a pandemic was not possible because everyone was having to plan for a no-deal Brexit. Well, surely that's the point.
The evidence doesn't bear that out.
Okay, great, thank you. And just getting on to error and fraud, I noticed that there has been, the Public Accounts Committee recently came out talking about fraud and error, saying that total fraud and error across COVID employment schemes delivered by HMRC was an estimated £4.5 billion, of which the department expects to recoup just £1.1 billion. And they criticised the length of time the government was taking to recover those taxpayer pounds. I wonder
Is that
if you'd
out
like
of the
to comment
business?
on that.
Is that the business? That's the
You're
business.
representing the
Yeah,
UK
the 4.5
government.
billion. Yeah, so that is out of 150 or 146 billion of business support. Okay, so what does that work out at? Less than 3%?
It's about 4.6% apparently. I think that's of the total expended in the three schemes: the coronavirus job retention scheme, the self-employed income support scheme, and the Eat Out to Help Out scheme. Equivalence.
So and your number, sorry, your
estimate,
percentage number was how much?
4.6%.
Yes,
I think,
yeah,
isn't it?
less than 5%.
4.5.
Less than 5%.
So that's acceptable, isn't it?
It's not a case of it being acceptable.
Okay.
But it's a case of if you run a loan book, for example, if you're a bank and you have bad loans, you are you're in the same sort of category at less than 5%.
Okay.
I'm not saying it's acceptable and you don't want it to happen, but that is within commercial margins of running a loan book. And when you actually send money to people without them actually filling out any forms, without you doing any credit checks on them, I would say it's actually remarkably. What I think the lesson of this is how remarkably honest the British people are, actually.
Okay, but that is a considerable amount of money. What concerns is the Scotland office raising with the UK government about trying to claw some more of that money back? Well, is that something that is your responsibility as someone who's responsible for business?
Yes, there is absolutely a review of this going on. And it's within the Treasury, obviously, is where they sent the money out. That is under review. It will also be considered in the COVID inquiry. We're not
Are you on top of it, though?
Absolutely, we're on top of it, because as I just indicated to you, overall, that is within the realms of running a loan book in terms of a bad loan position at 5%. It actually tells you that in the main, the money was well targeted and well received and being paid back. That's not to say it shouldn't therefore be recovered where it can be recovered.
But that doesn't sound like you're pursuing it yourself. Is this something that concerns
as
you?
Far as
because you seem to be accepting it as a sort of necessary result of handing out that money as quickly
I don't reside in the department whose responsibility it is to recover the money.
Sure.
So therefore you need to inquire of that department what the precise steps they're taking to recover that money.
Does the Scotland office ever, and you as a representative unit for business for the Scotland office, do you not feel concerned enough to contact the department yourself? For that matter, the Department of Health and Social Care, which apparently, according to the Public Accounts Committee, wasted an extraordinary £14.9 billion on PPE and related COVID expenditure. What are you doing to
Again,
this?
this is an unfortunate byproduct of the speedy response that was required to save 15 million jobs, keep the population in employment, allow our economy to return. There are bad actors, unfortunately, in this world that we live in, but the lessons that we're learning out of this is that the British people in general are very trustworthy, hard-working and honest people.
Mm. Well, yeah, of course, but clearly there were some problems here, so they presumably need to be addressed by the UK government.
When was the last time you got a loan from a bank where they didn't check whether you could pay it back? It's never been done before.
Okay.
It's the most extraordinary experiment we just undertook, to give money to people without working out first whether we could get it back. And guess what? It's been returned.
Okay. Back in 2021, admittedly, but back in 2021, looking at some of the spending measures made by SNP ministers since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, the Scottish Government estimated fraud and error in those schemes to be no more than 1 to 2% of payments, approximately 16 million pounds to 16 million pounds to 32 million pounds, which is a significantly lower amount. Now, I don't have more up-to-date figures than that.
I'm finding it really difficult to concentrate because Mr. Ross is constantly and consistently barking into my ear. Would you please be quiet and let Miss Brock ask her questions and the Minister respond to them? Order. Miss Brock.
So it seems that there were 1 to 2% fraud and error Do you know, it really is very difficult to ask questions when you're constantly interrupting Mr. Ross.
Would you please stop
I didn't
interrupting?
interrupt you.
I'm not speaking to Ms.
I was
Brock.
tempting, but I didn't interrupt you. No, but you're speaking to the chair and everyone else can hear you. So just getting back to that point, yes, no, their estimate was something between 1 to 2% in terms of the schemes under discussion back in 2021. So it just seems that, you know, that seems like a very high amount. If it is around 4.5% lost to fraud and error, how do you explain that?
What are you trying to say? Are you trying to say that the Scots are a lower or higher?
Was the Scottish Government more efficient in handing out that money than the UK Government? I'm interested in your opinion on that.
I haven't seen any numbers that demonstrates that Scotland was any different from the rest of the United Kingdom. All the numbers that I've made inquiry of are basically saying that we're in line. Scotland's in line with the UK.
Last question was brought.
No, that's it. Great. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much. Andrew Weston.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, Lord Offord. One of the challenges that was undoubtedly encountered with the distribution of these funds to businesses was the ability to administer sectoral support because of a lack of information about exactly what activities businesses were engaged in. So I just wonder what lessons you feel we can learn from the pandemic in terms of how we improve data collection in Scotland, whether you think there would be a need, for instance, for a business register. Certainly places like Belgium have considerably more information on businesses, and I just wonder whether you think that would be helpful moving forward in order to properly understand what businesses are doing so that support can be best targeted.
Yeah, it's a fair question. I think I think in the UK we are always striving to improve the data that we collect, and obviously that will increase as we go more and more digital. We'll be able to do that better. Obviously, we have to get the balance right between that and allowing people to maintain their privacy. But there is no question that we want to get better at data collection, and that the government does have the Office of National Statistics doing this. We do want to improve on that. There are concepts of different schemes being discussed about whether you have the business register for sectors, etc. We did hear some grumbling, for example, in the agricultural community about differences in how that was administered between England and Scotland. We did hear some differences around retail between Scotland and England. So there were some differences employed, and yes, on the face of it, if we had better data, we would have been able to drill down into that. But at the end of the day, we were in a pandemic. It was an emergency situation. We acted fast, and on balance, it was a pretty good job.
So I guess the obvious question then is, have there been any discussions that you are aware of within government and between the Scottish government and the UK government as to what sort of information it might be helpful to collect in future? Is that something?
Yes, well, there's discussions. I know that certainly Fraser Ralliner Institute are looking at this, and the Federation of Small Businesses have got an opinion on this. It's an ongoing discussion.
Oh, we've finished.
Could I
Unexpectedly,
Chair, since we've got time.
Of course.
Thank you. One of the issues that we did raise with the Federation of Small Businesses last week was, now we've moved beyond the immediate health response of COVID, and businesses are still trying to get back on their feet. One of the things they were concerned about was the increased level of legislation coming from the Scottish Government to Scottish businesses. What discussion have you had with the business sector in Scotland about legislation? And they particularly highlighted, for example, the DRS scheme, which obviously the UK government has been involved in as well. Schemes like that, the workplace parking levy and such like, are actually putting businesses off, particularly FSB members, in their big small business survey that came out. What do you hear from Scottish businesses about the level of legislation coming from the Scottish Government and how that's impacting their businesses?
Yes, I speak regularly to the Scottish business community, to stakeholders, and I do detect a frustration that they feel that they are in some ways having to deal with a greater amount of regulation. And I think the word is divergence. Business does not appreciate additional regulation and divergence from the UK. The market is a UK market. They want a single market. For Scotland, 60% of our trade in Scotland is with the rest of the United Kingdom, 20% with Europe, 20% with international. So whether it's things like DRS, whether it's things like the gene editing thing, for example, where, that is technology invented in Scotland, in the James Hutton Institute, and being adopted everywhere in the UK except in Scotland. Seems slightly odd. You've got the issues around sort of there was going to be alcohol advertising bans. There's differences going around, on rent freezes. The message I'm getting is why is it different? Why is it different in Scotland? Why is it putting up barriers? Because we want to trade across the whole United Kingdom. I get that a lot.
And in some of these areas, for example, DRS, we are told by the Scottish Government that the UK Government are disrespecting devolution by getting involved. But certainly from what I hear from businesses, they actually welcome the fact that one of Scotland's governments, the UK Government, listened to the concern of business over DRS and actually is putting forward suggestions for a UK-wide scheme that they would be happy to work with.
Yes.
Do you agree with the SNP that it was disrespecting devolution, or do you agree with the businesses that it was actually vital for the UK Government to get involved and come forward to try and have a scheme that works across the whole of the UK?
I think the whole point of devolution is that devolution is a settlement within a concept which has existed for 315 years called the United Kingdom. And the SNP government are very familiar with the concept of a single market. They love the European single market, 27 countries, they want to be part of that single market. What they don't seem to like so much is the concept of a UK single market. And yet for the UK to work properly, we need a single market. And the whole point of the UK Internal Market Act is basically to say that the presumption should be that in these islands we do everything the same unless there are legitimate reasons for exclusions, to which we set a high bar. Okay? And so therefore what the businesses are saying to us, we're getting an increasing number of exclusions, we're getting an increasing number of divergence. The business community do not like that.
Thank you.
Dr. Offord.
Just to follow up on that, waste management has been devolved for almost 25 years. And the principle of devolution does allow difference. And actually, there was lots of difference when the UK, including Scotland, was within the EU and didn't seem to be a problem. The internal market in Europe allows exemptions for public health and environment. Why does the internal UK market not allow that?
The issue with the DRS scheme is simply because, again, the product, the bottles don't respect borders, and having a scheme that works in one part and not in another part is fundamentally not working. And what the Scottish business response was that certainly a lot of English suppliers would stop supplying the Scottish market.
The original plan was all four nations were planning to include glass.
I think that's where we come to.
UK government that changed.
I think that's where we got to. It's a good place, which is we want to do it together.
I asked the Prime Minister this in the liaison committee last week. Does the UK government increasingly see its role as to correct and, if necessary, overrule Scottish government and schemes and measures it doesn't like? It sees as
no, quite the opposite.
But you have it.
Quite the opposite. Because part of the generous settlement where money is sent from London to Edinburgh with no strings attached comes the responsibility of the Scottish Government to legislate within the rules of the devolution settlement. So what the UK Government is wanting the Scottish Government to do is legislate legitimately within the generous devolution settlement, and we'll all get along fine and work together on that. Where the UK Government has to get involved is where the Scottish Government either goes across competence or puts a scheme in place which is the detriment of the rest of the United Kingdom. And at that point, the UK government has got no choice but to...
Can you explain why the UK government changed its mind on glass, the most dangerous litter and one of the most recyclable materials? Because that's what changed. Scotland and Wales didn't change from the start of all four nations planning to do the same thing. In terms of the outcome, where we've come out as an outcome is to find a way that works for everyone in the UK, and the best way to do that is to focus on plastics. But you're not planning to do anything
that is going to be the UK scheme. The best way to deal with this is plastic. That's what the public want to see most. Plastic
last
recycling.
Question from Wendy Chamberlain. Wendy.
Thank you very much. There's been cross-party consensus on DRS, or the need for a DRS scheme, and as Dr Whitford said, across all four nations. One of the reasons given for the delay by the Scottish Government is the fact that we're moving to a UK government, that we want to roll out on a UK basis. Are you confident that the UK Government is moving ahead in line with the timescales for DRS? Are we confident the UK Government scheme is going to be delivered?
Yeah, I mean, DEFRA are very committed to the whole recycling agenda, absolutely.
And there's nothing that would suggest to you that they're not going to meet those timescales?
No?
Okay, thank you.
Okay, right, we've knocked off at exactly 4 o'clock, which was an hour which we zoomed that we would have with you, Minister. We're very grateful to you for coming along once again to this committee, and I think there's a couple of things that you said you might follow up on if you could just supply that to the committee. I'm sure that your officials will have taken note. But for today, thank you once again, Lord Offord, for helping us out in this inquiry. Order, order.